Hi folks, welcome to this latest episode of the Physical Education Podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about masks. So my plan at the moment is I have my newsletter and the plan is to write maybe 2-3 newsletters per week on a topic or surrounding a topic, and to then do an audio podcast sort of expanding on that, just because I find that it's sort of different ways of thinking for me. So my main objective is to educate you, to give you new ideas, new perspectives, because ultimately I feel like the solutions to your pain, to your problems, are usually just within your grasp. Like, there's nothing new to be discovered really. Everything you need to get better is there and available to you, but you don't realize it and you don't really grasp it. And half the battle is basically giving you the information in a way that resonates with you, and then you can act upon it. And the story I always refer to is being taught how to breathe years and years ago by an osteopath, and it just didn't land. And part of that, can be the way it's shown to you. Maybe someone isn't a good teacher, but then part of it is maybe you're just not receptive to it. Maybe you're just not there. Maybe it's just you're not hearing it in a way that makes sense to you. So it's not bad teaching, but it's often a combination of both. So long story short, I like to kind of offer solutions or insights or ideas from multiple perspectives with different analogies. Hopefully, sort of in a, throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks. So maybe there's just a certain way that I'll explain something that resonates with you, and then it clicks, and then it's working unconsciously, and you find that your behavior and your actions, they begin to change in light of what you now understand, which I think is the big sort of unsung hero and unrecognized, crucial point that we need for recovery. It's, I think, ultimately about education and understanding things fully. So that's a bit of just a bit of reasoning behind the way I'm going to be doing my newsletters, and then in addition to that doing sort of audio podcasts, kind of rambling. You can see I tend to ramble, and it's different. It's just different forms of communication. I find it really beneficial to write. It's more concise. I have to kind of think a bit more about what I'm saying, but then there are certain things that you can only or that are better conveyed with, this sort of the pauses and the expressions and the tone that come from speaking. So, today I'm going to be talking about masks, the whole thing with masks these days. I wrote about that in my newsletter. Hopefully you read that. You should sign up to that on my website. So basically the whole thing with masks, so apparently we're divided over wearing a mask. Obviously we're in a global pandemic, and the first thing I'll say is that I'm not against masks, and I'm not, basically my position is, before we get into it, is that you shouldn't mandate a one-size-fits-all solution. So this is what we have in Ireland, in public places, public transport, places of work. You have to wear a mask. There can be fines. I think at some point there can be potentially prison time if you keep getting caught. But now the good thing might be that they're not really enforcing it. I haven't really heard of anything being enforced, but the reality is that they are putting in these laws or rules with the threat of them being enforced. And I don't think something like that should be mandated. Something that surrounds a fundamental human function, the most vital human function, which is breathing, should not be regulated by anyone. Particularly in this case of this pandemic that turns out to not have been the plague. So that's my position, and it's not to say that you shouldn't, and it's not to say that I don't, because I do wear the masks at times, somewhat because I just want to be left alone, and somewhat because I get it. I get the solidarity angle. I get the some people maybe don't have the defenses, and I would feel bad to some level if I had been the one to transmit it, though I think it's fairly unlikely that I'm going to transmit it to someone who's really at risk with the way I live my life. But I think if you're going to say, am I pro-mask or anti-mask, or whatever box you want to put me in, I'm going to be more on the anti-mask side of things, ultimately because of the principle of personal ownership of health, and that health should not be a one-size-fits-all approach, which mandating masks is. We shouldn't do that. It's fundamentally wrong. It's not going to work, and it's going to have negative downsides, and we'll get to that. So this, I guess, is, if it's going to change anyone's mind, is going to be hopefully more someone who is for the masks or for mandating the masks, or who maybe doesn't see any downsides with the masks. And the simple question I'd ask you, and I'd want you to consider, is if you think that the masks are good, that they are a suitable strategy, among other things, then why don't you wear the mask all the time? So why don't you just, if you believe that wearing a mask when you go about your life is going to create a net benefit to yourself and to the wider society, why don't you just wear it the whole time? And I mean, hopefully, we're not having a conversation, but I'm going to assume that you realize that there's a point at which you should stop wearing the mask. You shouldn't wear it 100% of the time. So that tells you that it isn't a universal good. It doesn't have a net positive effect across the board. There is a point at which the masks become too much. Now, the challenge with this is that it's tremendously individual. There's a point at which you're going to be struggling to breathe. There's a point at which you may be breathing bacteria and different viruses, perhaps not even COVID-19 viruses, that are in the mask, and you're essentially holding that up to your airways, and you're rebreathing that and giving it more of an opportunity to propagate and potentially infect you. So there are all of these considerations. Now you might say that, well, the benefits outweigh the costs, the potential costs, and that might be true, but the point I really want to drive home is how individual that is, because the issue with masks would be, one of the issues is that you're rebreathing carbon dioxide, and people say, oh well, not really, because it seeps out the sides, and yeah, depending on the mask, depending on the way it's worn, depending on how much carbon dioxide you produce, depending on how much you exhale, you're going to have variable levels of carbon dioxide that you are re-inhaling. And you will also have a variable individual amount or level of tolerance to carbon dioxide. So if you produce a lot of carbon dioxide, you don't need extra. So rebreathing it is likely going to be too much. But a lot of people actually don't produce that much carbon dioxide because they've got inefficient metabolism, they're not that healthy, and so they can rebreathe the carbon dioxide for quite some time, and it's actually beneficial. So this is one thing that I considered when the masks became mandated. This wasn't my stance from the start. I was a bit more optimistic. I thought, oh, this will be interesting because this might actually be beneficial for some people outside of the whole viral side of things, because they're going to be rebreathing more carbon dioxide, which can be very helpful. It's sort of a traditional remedy for anxiety or panic attacks, that kind of thing, is to breathe into a bag and rebreathe your carbon dioxide. I don't know if they still do this, but if you're old enough, you might see the infographics on planes when you go on a plane journey. And if someone is panicking, they would breathe into a bag, and they're rebreathing their carbon dioxide. And the value of that is that your carbon dioxide is necessary for oxygen to be used. So oxygen is just one sort of portion of breathing and oxygenation. You need carbon dioxide for it to actually be used. So if you don't have enough carbon dioxide, no amount of oxygen is going to do the trick, because it's sort of the classic story of no nutrient really works in isolation. So you can talk about calcium. Well, what about vitamin D? What about magnesium? What about zinc? And this kind of goes for everything. There's nothing that I know of that really works in isolation and that can't be aided or impaired with the lack or, presence of other substances. So we always need to look at things in context. So the point being, long story short, again, a rambling point, is that increasing your carbon dioxide levels through rebreathing carbon dioxide can actually be beneficial, but there's going to be a point at which it is not beneficial, and that point is tremendously individual. I've found for myself, wearing the mask, it's not that long before I start to get headaches, I start to kind of overheat, and yeah, that's in terms of carbon dioxide. I've had other symptoms, but so for me that happens pretty quickly, and from that I can kind of surmise, and it makes sense with how I live my life, the foods I eat, is that I would produce a high amount of carbon dioxide. So my body has plenty of carbon dioxide, and it doesn't really need that much more. So I feel the negative effects of rebreathing carbon dioxide pretty quickly, because it doesn't take much for me to go beyond the level of carbon dioxide that I need. Now again, someone else, maybe they don't produce that much carbon dioxide, and that's generally going to be a bad thing. Their body's not producing carbon dioxide. This is what should happen from efficient metabolism. And so they're rebreathing it, and it's good. It helps them. It's beneficial. And so it might take them a much longer time to notice any adverse effects. And for them, the 20-minute trip to the shop, or whatever it is, it's never going to become an issue, because it takes them longer than that to have negative effects from the carbon dioxide. So hopefully that makes sense. But the point is really, yeah, it's the individual point, and it's kind of, I get that this might be frustrating because it kind of makes things more complicated, and I get that. I've heard people complain that, it's all a bit much, And this is the thing, is that, like, you don't get to choose how much is too much. Like, you don't get to choose the laws of nature and how much you want to abide by them. I mean, I guess you can, in the sense that you can throw caution to the wind and deal with the consequences as they arise. But, if you are interested in health, you don't get to dictate what is necessary for good health. Evolution or nature, or whatever you want to call it, God has determined that, and we just need to kind of go along with it. Same way when you break your leg, you don't get to say, oh, this is annoying, why can't my leg be immediately healed? It's just not the way it works. There are laws and rules and principles that apply, and I mean, you can ignore them or you can abide by them. So it's complicated, and there's no two ways about it. I get that. It's very complicated, but it's reality. And the sooner you kind of get on board with reality, the better outcomes you're going to get. And I think that it's part of a bigger issue of ownership when it comes to health. Health needs to be done in such a way as that, I'm not speaking properly. It needs to be done in a way that puts personal ownership at the forefront. That needs to underpin everything, because I mean, it just doesn't work any other way. Because of the complexity of health, because of the individuality of it, because any issue you have, particularly chronic issues, are intertwined with the unique tapestry and history of your life and your personality and your experiences, that if you really want to get over complex issues, you need to be in the driver's seat, and you need assistance and guidance perhaps from other people, but you need to be in charge as much as possible, because there's too much complicated, intricate individual stuff that is just realistically going to be missed by someone who doesn't really know you as well as you know yourself. So personal responsibility and personal ownership needs to underpin all aspects of health. From that point of view, because of the complexity and individuality of it, and also because ultimately you're the one who needs to take the actions. So no one can do it for you. and this is very well understood in the realm of fitness, because no one is going to lift the weights for you. But the same thing goes for health. It's less tangible, it's less obvious, but no one can do it for you. Obviously, in the case of surgeries and things like that and traumatic injuries, I want to make a clear distinction between medicine for the care of chronic issues versus medicine for traumatic injuries. Obviously, that's a different thing. But when it comes to chronic health issues and lifestyle issues, and even things like respiratory health in a viral pandemic, you need to take action. It's up to you. No one can do it for you. And I think also there's a darker side of this, where the bottom line is no one's going to care about your issue as much as you are. Because as much as you might find a great doctor or whatever, at 5 o'clock they clock out, they go home, they have their life, they have their own issues, and there's just a certain reality to that no one can or probably should really care about the issue as much as you do. And that should distinction is important, because that's the thing, as a caregiver myself, as someone who treats people and who has a natural caregiving disposition, I would guess, is that it's very easy to want to help people and to give a lot of yourself to help people, and it's very draining and it's not sustainable. And I think a more sustainable approach is for everyone to assume responsibility at the core of the issue. So you start with personal responsibility, and you can have help in addition to that. You can have support, you can have societies and groups and medical care that supports that, but the fundamental starting point of personal responsibility needs to be there. So that's sort of, again, a kind of rambling point about masks and how I kind of, it's the complexity of individual levels of health, individual lifestyles, and it's an interesting thing that's sort of happened with the whole COVID pandemic, is suddenly this idea that you are responsible for someone else's health has come to the forefront, and it's this talking point where you have to do this for someone else. And I understand that, again, to some extent. I don't want to make someone else sick. I want to live in a way that doesn't harm other people. But I feel like this narrative is to the detriment of understanding how much power people have in their own health, and even in the case of a global pandemic, because what doesn't seem to be talked about is so the virus is only one component, but the virus in some people it's just there. It doesn't infect them. They just happen to be carrying it. And in other people, it infects them and they have all sorts of long-term issues and they might die, and that's awful, obviously. But so the virus can do both of those things, and what you should be really focusing on in that instance is, okay, so what's the difference between those two people? And that would be, the individual, understanding the individual, understanding the environment. Because if you can have a disease where in one person they carry it and don't even notice, and in another person they're bedridden and they eventually die, then there's a tremendous amount of wiggle room. So how can we work with that wiggle room rather than making it all about this virus? And it's not to say that we should ignore the virus or we should be careless, but surely just through that analysis we should have a good indication that we should focus heavily on that individual component and make it clear to people. Like, it's kind of clear to see if you pause to analyze it, but I don't really hear many people, certainly not the people who are shaping a lot of these policies and actions, and governments, health agencies, influential people on the topic. I'm sure some of them are talking about this, but it's not a major talking point. This idea that, oh, by the way, you have tremendous power in avoiding getting infected. Now, what they will say is that you have power in not infecting others. And that's true. You know, you can choose not to lick someone's eyeball or cough up their nose. And I think most of us do that. Most of us choose not to do that, even pre, COVID pandemic. But making myself laugh. It's, I don't know. It just all of this doesn't really make much sense to me. I wonder. People get really squeamish around this kind of talk because they're like, well, why would they do this? And oh, you're just a conspiracy theorist, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if Bill Gates, cooked up the virus and set it off on a monkey and a pangolin or whatever into a Chinese market. I don't know. I mean, maybe it sounds unlikely. I wouldn't be inclined to believe that. But when it comes to like, why would they ignore this? I have the same question. Why would governments and health agencies and the World Health Organization and all these people not really drive home all of these other points? And it's something that I think is best explained with a simple analogy of, if I go to a doctor and I have a problem and I say I want the problem solved, and there are a dozen solutions, but they only really drive home one of those solutions or two of those solutions. Those being, well, you can isolate until we have a vaccine and then you'll have to take the vaccine. So those are the two solutions. But why not the other solutions? Why not just tell me everything? Why not just tell me all of my options? Now, if you go to a doctor or if you go to a surgeon or whatever and they only give you some of the solutions and ignore the other solutions that maybe have fewer downsides, that are healthier, that are cheaper, and that are less restrictive on your life, that's kind of unethical. I mean, it's totally unethical. I hesitate to say it almost because all of this is so ridiculous. Like, if you omit information and you are the authority on health and you're to some extent dictating how the world is being shaped, and you're omitting information that is well established, that's really sneaky. Like, I can only take that as a sneaky, snaky action. And maybe it's not that. Maybe they're just mistaken. Maybe they're like, yeah, actually, we forgot to say that personal responsibility is important, that you can modulate your immune system, that you can, that the virus is just one component. We forgot to say that. It was so self-evident to us that we just didn't feel the need to drive that point home. So we're sorry. But based on what I've seen, I don't see much indication that is the case, but it is a possibility. And the point there with anything that sounds a bit conspiratorial or that you're a bit squeamish with, like, how could they all be in on this or whatever, is to just take a step back and just understand that it is entirely possible. It's also entirely possible that it's just all due to incompetence. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. The motive doesn't really matter. The actions are what matters. And the actions that I see are that they are ignoring the lifestyle and individual components of health that would mitigate the problem of COVID-19. They're ignoring those, and those are well established. So make of that what you will. So the next thing I wanted to kind of discuss is, you might be thinking, so I mentioned there that the mask is going to impair your oxygenation. And there was one video in particular that sought to debunk this, and it's an Irish doctor. I forget his name, but the video went viral, so you can probably find it easily, and I could link it, I guess. But he was saying that I get a lot of it was like one of these TikTok style 1-minute videos, and he was saying, I get a lot of concern from my patients saying, will wearing a mask affect my oxygen levels? And he was like, I'm going to prove to you that it doesn't. So he sits there in front of the camera for a minute, and he's hooked up to like an oxygen meter of some sort, and he puts on a mask, and then another, and then another. He puts on 6 surgical masks, and his oxygen levels do not change. Now, the issue with that is, well, if we're going to look at that purely as a scientific experiment, which it's framed in that way, it's framed in this kind of like, look, I'm going to conduct an experiment to prove this to you. Well, it's terrible science. It's a 1-minute experiment. It's a 1-person sample size, arguably a biased sample, because he is a person who's heavily pushing this idea that everyone should be wearing a mask. So he's biased. Just for the sake of being perfectly honest, I don't think that means he's being paid off by big mask manufacturers or anything like that. But there's a bias there. It's a 1-minute video, and he's just sitting there. So most people aren't going to be wearing a mask for just 1 minute. They're going to be wearing a mask for several minutes. And again, my point is that it doesn't really matter at this population-wide level, because for you it might take a minute, for someone else it might take 30 minutes, for someone it might take 30 seconds before they start getting signs of excess carbon dioxide. And that's the point, is that you have a 1-person sample size, and what effects do you have when you look at 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people, or large portions of the world population. Excuse me. I have a cough at the moment, which I will get to later, which is related to masks. But so this doctor did this video, and it's biased. It's a small sample size. It's not representative of anything, and it only lasts 1 minute, so it doesn't, it's not representative of anything. And also, he's just looking at oxygen levels. Maybe it would take longer for his oxygen levels to change. Maybe if it lasted 2 minutes, we would have seen an oxygen level change. Maybe with someone else, we would have seen an oxygen level change after 30 seconds. I don't know. But what I do know is that the point at which that oxygen level would have changed would have been individual. The other thing is that he's only looking at oxygen levels. So what about measuring carbon dioxide? What about measuring stress hormones, changes in stress hormones when you are suddenly unable to breathe? I think that would be very, very telling to see how much stress is induced in a person when they're wearing a mask, and for how long, and at what point. And again, I'm not even interested in seeing, I don't really care about the results, because I know that it's going to be individual. It's going to be down to a number of things, and if some person can tolerate it for 10 minutes, that doesn't mean that you can. And ultimately, you need to determine for yourself what your tolerance is with breathing and what you can manage. Excuse me. So, yeah, that was just one kind of probably the most prominent, debunking of this idea that breathing, that masks impair your oxygen. So obviously these people are claiming that, look, wearing a mask isn't going to affect your oxygen levels. Here's the proof with crappy science. And what's interesting is that, again, this kind of relates to a bigger issue of, that is clearly really bad science. And I don't think that, I have no reason to believe that this guy's being willfully dishonest, or he's trying to be deceptive. I think, he genuinely believes what he believes in, and he's probably a very nice person, means well, cares about his patients. I would say it's just, it was an oversight of some sort. Whatever it is, again, I don't know the motivation, and the motivation kind of doesn't matter. The actions are what matters. The information, the facts are what matters. So the point is that if you're going to sort of toe the line and push the dominant narrative, you can kind of get away with doing, shoddy science, essentially. If you're going to, because I'm pointing all of these things out, and I'm picking apart his 1 minute Twitter video, TikTok style thing, and people might be like, oh, it's just a video, you're being too harsh. And that's kind of it, is that he's pushing something that supports the narrative, that supports something that I think is just way too simplistic, and ultimately not that helpful, because it undermines the complexity of the issue, and it doesn't really equip people appropriately to handle the issue in a way that suits them most. But he's pushing this kind of idea, and he's going with the narrative, which is fair enough if that's what he believes in. But because he's going with the narrative, he can get away with this kind of loose, not very scientific, appears like science, appears credible, appears authoritative, because he's a doctor, and he can get away with that. But if you go against the narrative, if you start to question that kind of thing, if you start to question the orthodoxy, you are going to be held to a much, much higher standard. And that's something as a listener that you should look out for, is the level of scrutiny that the two, so if there are two sides opposed, what level of scrutiny are both sides put under? Are they put under equal levels of scrutiny, or do you have one side that's kind of the dominant side, and it's accepted, and so we play a bit loose with facts, we play a bit loose with rigorous scientific methods, because we're like, oh, well, it's self-evident. But anything that then contradicts that, suddenly we're Sherlock Holmes, suddenly we're looking at all the fine details, we're like, oh, look at this, what about this, and you're picking it apart in a similar way that I might have picked apart that doctor's video. But the point is that it's rooted in this wider point of what's really informing and dictating the forces that shape the world we live in. So like this year, life has changed significantly, and I don't think we're anywhere close being out of this. I think this is, they go on about the new normal. I think this is life now, which is awful. I hate the thought of that. But a lot of these forces operate not with facts or reason or convincing people of the truth, but they operate via a form of authority. So not necessarily authority by direct force, by forcing people into submission into a certain way, but by saying, look, these are the doctors, these are the experts, this is what they say. And then you might say, well, what about these doctors? What about these experts who disagree? Oh, no, they're quacks. Debunk them. And we're going to debunk them then with really shoddy science, which you're not going to notice because maybe you don't understand enough anyway, but because you don't hold these people to the same standard, because you value their authority. And this can be tremendously hard to recognize in ourselves. And we all do this to a certain extent. It's a natural tendency to value a certain amount of authority. Like, if you're looking up the review to a restaurant, 1,000 people said it was brilliant. And you can be like, well, I mean, that probably means it's a good restaurant. That's a reasonable assumption to make. So there's value to it. But when it's done in this way, it can also be, and I say done in this way, I don't even necessarily think that this is all done on purpose. I think a lot of this is rooted in the chaos of a planet with 7 billion people, and people of different values and interests, and corporations who have agendas, and governments and political parties who have, whatever. It's just a big mess of chaos, with some level of conspiracy here, but maybe conspiracy there that goes against it, and it's not necessarily this grand unifying thing. But in the whole sort of chaos and mess of it, our tendency to kind of go with authority and trust authority, which arguably is deeply ingrained from a very young age, from school, from all sorts of things, and that's another rabbit hole that you can get into. We sort of naturally default towards this, well, they couldn't all be wrong, it's the World Health Organization. Like, they're the health organization of the world, surely that must mean something. And I hope that it means something, but a lot of it is kind of arbitrary. Like, if a day before I could have registered that company, and that could have been me in a shed in my garden called the World Health Organization. So we kind of have to be very vigilant of, again, not necessarily purposeful, but just these little tricks that can be played on us and that we can fall for, and that, don't really prove anything or don't really substantiate what we think they substantiate. So really, ultimately, it's a long-winded way of saying there's always this element of authority, and we need to be able to question authority and understand that consensus and authority don't have a monopoly on the truth. If the World Health Organization tells you that 2 + 2 = 5, it doesn't make it true. Or the World Mathematics Association tells you 2 + 2 is 5. It doesn't make it true. The truth is the truth, regardless of how many people say it or understand it. So there's this, again, it's sort of a rambling point, a tangent, but that's why I think all of this is so important, because you might be thinking, well, it's just a mask, it's just a mask. But there's always all of this other stuff kind of tacked onto it, again, not necessarily on purpose, maybe just by happenstance, maybe just in the chaos of everything, it just kind of gets rolled up into it with our natural tendencies, combined with the tendencies of psychopaths to want to exploit people. But within all of these things, there are these far deeper issues that, if we just kind of accept, oh yeah, I'll just wear a mask, oh, that's no big deal, whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's just a mask. And I get that. And it's so much easier. That's why I wear a mask. I'm like, I'm not bothered with this. It's grand. For the most part, it's grand. I get on with my life, wear a mask. I'm left alone. And I totally, totally get that. But it's the principle of accepting something without just cause. Without evidence. We'll just go along with this. And it doesn't make sense. It's not validated. It comes from shoddy science. There's a level of deception or lies of omission. And, just go along with it. And again, you might say, well, it's just a mask and it's inconsequential. And I get that it's probably largely inconsequential. So it's not really about the mask. My concern isn't so much about the mask. It's about a tendency in human beings to just be totally swayed towards something. Like, suddenly, if you told someone a year ago, by the way, in 9 months from now, you might feel, maybe some people, you will feel compelled to shout at someone who isn't wearing a mask on public transport, or something like that. Or 9 months from now, you're going to be shouted at by multiple people and attacked for not wearing a mask. You'd be like, what? Why? That would never happen. And yeah, it's this larger issue of this human tendency to just kind of trust authority, not really question things, not really think for ourselves, because, and I've talked about this before, it takes a lot of energy to think for yourself. It's more energy, it's more economical to just go with the flow. It's easier to just say, oh, well, everyone likes McDonald's, I'll go to McDonald's, or whatever it is, So I think, again, to kind of talk to a broader topic that I think we need to understand, because we kind of get caught up in this mask, no mask, pandemic, scamdemic, plandemic, whatever, Bill Gates, get caught up in all these things, left versus right. We need to elevate the way we think. We need to elevate the way we live our lives, the way we challenge things. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and that goes hand in hand with taking responsibility for health and just kind of confronting the reality that, you know, the laws of nature are there. We can either abide by them or take shortcuts and suffer the consequences. So yeah, it is this wider issue. And so if you're inclined to say, well, it's just a mask, you know, it's, what's the big deal? I would urge you to kind of, yeah, you can say, yeah, it is just a mask, that's fine. But understand that tendency of just sort of going along with it without really any good enough reason, with shady science, or shoddy science, not shady science, that tendency to just kind of go along with the crowd and just kind of accept it and roll over and not, and I include myself in that. It's something I'm grappling with at the moment. And like, I'm not happy that, you know, because really I feel like I should just like take a stand, but I don't want to. I really don't. You know, I just want to be left alone. I don't want to do any of this, you know. It just seems like a, you know, in terms of my day-to-day life, it just seems like a waste of time. But like, when I see this larger tendency and what it might mean, because all it is that, like, this is just this human tendency, and maybe this is an inconsequential thing, but then you throw in something that is consequential, and you have this same natural tendency to just go with it. You know, if you get the right experts, if you get Lady Gaga to back something up, you know, everyone will just go along with it, or, you know, a portion of the population will just be like, oh yeah, Lady Gaga, and pair her with some doctor, and they'll recommend something that's a load of nonsense. But, you know, you'll just go with it, and you'll go with the crowd, and maybe Lady Gaga's a genocidal maniac and whatever. And I'm not saying that's true, but I'm saying it's about that principle of not questioning things and just going along with things, and just avoiding the challenge of thinking more deeply and standing for something and having principles and standing for your principles and your values. And like I said, I include, like, this podcast is as much for myself as it is for anyone else. Like, I'm not happy with how I'm dealing with this, but I'm making an effort, but I could be doing better. So it's not to judge you and hold myself all high and mighty. But yeah, I think there is a bigger issue rooted within this mask debate. And for now it's masks. Eventually it'll be a vaccine, which, I mean, I won't get into it today, but we'll have all sorts of questionable concerns surrounding that. And that isn't an anti-vax sentiment, it's just an anti-rushed corporate medicine sentiment. But anyway, that's for another day. So I'm going to wrap up there. Turns out I actually have a lot more to discuss, so maybe this will be a 2-part thing, but that's long enough for today. So I hope you enjoyed that. Hope it made you think, you know, kind of consider a different side. What I would say for you, what this means for you, just pay attention to your breathing. At what point does the mask become too much? And don't be afraid to take off the mask and just breathe and recover and make sure that you're taking care of your health, because ultimately you need to take care of your health, because no one else is going to care as much as you. So by prioritizing your own health, you're actually putting the rest of the world, you're actually helping the world more than you might think. I don't think it's selfish. So yeah, hope that made you think. I hope you've come away from this with a slightly different perspective, a bit more open to the whole debate, and seeing kind of seeing past the whole us versus them, and, you know, the hysteria of it, and seeing that there is a legitimate cause for concern, but as usual it's all a bit of a mess, and, you know, it needs some sifting. So yeah, let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the next... I won't see you. You'll hear me, and I won't see you in the next episode. Bye.